So if you wanted to open, Mrs. McLaren, with any general comments about your time in the Coast Guard and how it affected you and your favorite memories and different things like that, anything you wanted to talk about?
Oh, okay. Well, I can say good evening to Ryan.
You need to.
And welcome to our evening of getting information on my many years in the United States Coast Guard SPAS. And SPAS is Semper Paratus, and the translation is always ready. That's how the name SPAS came about for the United States Coast Guard women.
So what was your job as a woman in the Coast Guard in World War II, and what did that entail?
Oh, in World War II, when I joined the Coast Guard, it was right at the very beginning, and so I was put out in the field, and I handled the recruiting in 5 of the New England states. We did not have Connecticut, because Connecticut was absorbed by New York. But I traveled the 5 New England states recruiting women to the Coast Guard.
What were maybe some of your favorite places to go to, or different experiences and memories you had about visiting different states across New England for the Coast Guard?
Well, it was most interesting because most towns that I went to, or cities, had what they call temporary reservists, who were members of the United States Coast Guard, who were not eligible to go into the service, but belonged locally in their town to the Coast Guard. And so they were very helpful, and all the towns really that the Coast Guard went to seemed to have water areas, ponds, or streams, or lakes, and so forth. So they were Coast Guard towns, well named, you know.
And what maybe was an average day on the job like for you? Were you in a recruiting office, or were you out walking around the towns and trying to meet, going door to door? What was kind of your average day on the job like?
Well, my average day in the Coast Guard was to be sure that I could set up an office in a location where people would see me, and so the girls would drop in and get information on the Coast Guard. And then when I recruited them, they would have to come to Boston to be enlisted. We had a Coast Guard office at 70 State Street in Boston. And so from there they would be assigned to a Coast Guard, what we call recruiting center, to get further information on the Coast Guard and get reassigned to a town or a state, or wherever the Coast Guard needed them.
And your job was to recruit other women to be recruiters for the Coast Guard? Or was it?
No, not necessarily, just to get them in, and then they would be assigned to given an assignment by the Coast Guard after they got in.
And you said a lot about how the papers always had pictures of the women in the service, the recruiters or the nurses and things like that, and how you're in the paper a lot. What was that like for you to see?
Well, it was very nice. Everywhere I went, everybody was very nice to me, and they always extended themselves and said that anything I wanted to know or do, they were right there, and they were. So I couldn't have met more wonderful people. And of course I had the advantage of being sort of so few in the recruiting business, that I was pretty much on my own. In fact, I lived at home and was paid for living at home, because every inch that they had to house the women that I recruited, they needed. And so they paid me for living at home. So that was kind of nice and kind of different.
And you and your husband were both in the Coast Guard. Did you meet in the Coast Guard, or were you?
No, see, I knew him from high school. And we were Dedhamites and Westwoodites. And Westwood and Dedham at that time, back in our day, was just had one high school, and that was Dedham High School. So the Westwoodites all were sent down to Dedham for high school education until 1940. In September of 1940, Westwood opened their own high school. But before that, they had to tuition all their students to Dedham.
And so you two were classmates at Westwood High, and then after you came back from the Coast Guard.
At Dedham High School.
At Dedham High.
There wasn't a high school but we were classmates. In fact, alphabetically, he sat in front of me for 4 years.
And then after you came back from your service?
After I came back from the service, my parents had moved to Westwood in 1944, and so Bill was a native. He was born and brought up right here, where we live now, and so he had, as I say, sat in front of me for 4 years right in high school, but didn't see him until I moved to the town.
What was some of the more, what was an unusual day that you might remember, or maybe an interesting experience that happened when you were in all over the New England area? What maybe an interesting memory you had? Well,
a real wonderful memory was, of course, the Coast Guard finally had a recruiting office, destination of their own to prepare the girls to going out on the field, and that was in Florida. So naturally they wanted me to see it, so I had to take a troop train of girls down to Florida, where they were to begin their training in the Coast Guard. And then I was to come back on my own after I left them there.
How do you think your years in the Coast Guard maybe made you a better leader, or changed the way you saw different problems, or the way you thought things through, how it impacted you, or how it affected the way you think?
It really, I really don't know what to say there, because it was just an everyday situation. It was wonderful. Every day was different, and they were all nice, and as I say, it was very unusual to be living at home, and of course it was a rarity for out here in Westwood to see a girl in the service, but I was here and commuted to Boston every day. So, they say the years went quickly.
And that poster behind you there, you said, was because since you were one of the first group of women to work in the Coast Guard, a lot of people didn't know about women being in the service, and so they made posters to show what this was for and about the women who were serving. And what was that like, being kind of in the first group of women to serve in the Coast Guard?
Well, as I say, the waves were first, and our uniforms were identical, except that we wore a shield, and that shield that we wore on our sleeves of our jackets identified us from the waves. And so, as I say, the uniform was identical, except for when the shield went on, it identified us as the waves were. And the Coast Guard had the shield, and that was the identifying between the two uniforms, because they were identical.
And was there ever a place maybe where people hadn't heard yet about women serving, or hadn't seen a group of women being recruiters in their town before? What was that experience like, if seeing a woman in uniform was a new thing for them?
Oh, it was, because, as I say, I was right out there in the very beginning, and as I went from state to state, it was very unusual to see or hear anything about the waves. Of course, being Navy had been heard about, but Coast Guard hadn't until I arrived, and then that was opening